So I've been reading a book about the Irish author Behan. He was a genius. He grew up in a Dublin working class home, and he got caught up in the despair of the Depression and channeled that energy into fighting the British occupation of Ireland through the IRA. And he was a man of many faces, often violent, a drunkard, a comedian, a singer of Irish ballads, and he became one of the deep soul voices of the Irish people. Not only could he capture the unique stories and lilt of the pubs and homes and streets of his native Dublin, more powerfully than O'Casey or James Joyce, but he found another voice through the study of the Irish language while he was in prison. And he became fascinated with this declining culture. And when in the 50s the Irish language was almost extinct, only a couple of very remote places in the west of the country, and especially he went to the Blasket Islands, where he felt more at peace, more at home. His autobiographer, Ogle O'Connor, compares the poetry he wrote in the 1940s and 50s when the Irish language and its bardic tradition that existed at the time of John the Baptist and Jesus when they walked the planet. His cadence and style could be compared to the poetic traditions of the 9th century medieval period without him knowing it. And he was a genius. Where did he get this voice from? A city boy moved to a remote island, the last edge of old Europe, in search of a voice that would speak to the ages. And Behan lived in squalor and poverty most of his life, but in finding his voice through that struggle, his anger and violence became somehow transformed into a very powerful spiritual love affair with his native Ireland. And he recaptured that image, this relationship. He called it the dark red rose, as sensuous and beautiful and sexual as any woman. The love of earth and sea and sky were windows into the divine lover. The passion for justice and seeking to overthrow 700 years of English rule in Ireland came from his deep faith in Jesus and his loyalty to the Catholic Church. His passion, his drinking, his brawling and violence isolated him from his family and friends, but he embraced a kind of tenacity, what we might describe in this liturgical season, a kind of advent, a longing for something that's not quite here yet. And this year I understand more of the depth of the character of John the Baptist because of my reading about Brendan Behan. And I used to see John the Baptist as a kind of freak, a kind of weird hippie, in strange clothing, ranting and raving in the wilderness, as abstemious and judgmental as any 16th century Calvinist preacher. No pleasure, no drinking, no comfort, and having a big mouth. As Behan would have said about him, his mouth hung like a skipping rope between his ears. So instead, I see the genius of John the Baptist. Here is a young man who was very cultured, well-read, from the city, from one of the noblest families of the day, the son of Zechariah, who was part of the religious government of Jerusalem. Zechariah was a priest who worked in the temple, so a blue-blooded Jew who was highly educated and destined for a life of privilege if he wanted it. Instead, the city boy finds his way from the center to the edge of his privilege to the desert to find himself and to find the voice of God. And he hears on the hot desert winds and he makes out the sharp, jagged mountain shapes that loom in the night the voice of God. And just as Behan found himself among the simple peasants who he regarded as the princes of the ancient bardic traditions of the Irish, so John the Baptist goes back to those simple peasant people who wore whatever nature provided. And he delves into that ancient ancestral tradition of the prophets. And both he and Jesus are fed by the 600-year-old tradition of Isaiah and Elijah. A voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. And as a marching army needed long, straight roads to go to battle, so the image of God coming like a mighty warrior to reclaim the land, his bride. And the city boy has tuned out into the prophetic voices of Isaiah and Elijah, who call Israel the bride, the unfaithful lover, whose sins were many. So John calls Israel to repent, to change heart and intent, and make herself clean through an individual act of surrender and baptism. And to John's father and to the religious establishment, to the majority of Jews, this proclamation was blasphemy. They were, after all, God's chosen clean people. They were the people of the Holy Covenant, and they knew righteousness. So the act of submission to baptism was a denial of their birthright, like burning the flag or desecrating a religious symbol for us today to make a point to wake people up. It had been 500 years since the voice was heard in Judea, and there was a kind of spiritual amnesia. The language, like the Irish language reclaimed by Brendan Behan, the ancestral voices, the language was foreign to the Jewish people at the time of Jesus and John. It was no longer relevant or necessary. The dying embers of what was once holy and dignified and a generous community had to be reformed around the city boy who becomes an instrument of the voice of God in the desert. So community forms around John, and their ministry is one of prayer and fasting, teaching, proclaiming, and baptizing whoever came to them. And one day, this unlikely person shows up for baptism. And John says, "Who you? You should be baptizing me." And it's interesting in today's gospel, the humanity of John. He's in prison. Obviously, the voice of God that's attracted the attention of the state. And so they want to silence him, and they put him in prison. And so he's uncertain if Jesus is the one. And I love this story because it's about John's humanity. In all his holiness, he still doesn't know it all. He's still not sure. And so there's an invitation for us as we journey through Advent, as we journey in the in-between places, that we accompany the ones who aren't sure, but show up and step up and continue to march on. The Advent theme is all about the people who aren't sure. It starts with Mary. It involves Joseph, it involves the shepherds. Soon it will involve the wise men. It's all about a not knowing, but somehow finding our way in the Advent journey. And so the humanity, the story of John is a wonderful story. And it is about where do we find the voice of God? And somehow that is not obvious. It's not kind of, suddenly I know it all. There's something about this story that invites us all to journey not knowing, but with hope. know, that wonderful hymn, O Come, Emmanuel. It's based on these ancient pieces of wisdom, the O key of O tree of Jesse, the key. They're often called the Advent O's, the star. And so the invitation as we think about our journey through Advent, the key, what in our lives has been locked away for a long time that maybe we now need to open? Or in the darkness and the struggle and the despair of the night, that little star. There's a wonderful tradition in the Jewish tradition of the remnant. It looks like everything is lost, but there's a little flickering flame that somehow is burning. It looks like the tree is dead, the stump of Jesse, but the little shoot is appearing through the snow, and there is hope. Here are the images of the voice of God. Are you the one who is to come, or are we to expect another? Can we hear the voice of God in our questions? And there's this thread that runs through Advent that keeps us moving even though we don't know. We're not certain. John has it, Mary has it, Joseph has it, the shepherds will have it, then the lost wise man. Sometimes the voice of God will come in unexpected guises and be played by unusual instruments. So this Advent, we ask ourselves, what darkness am I in? What excruciating uncertainties am I wriggling around in? Not you, not God, not this way. John says, you should be baptizing me. So to be open, Advent is about kind of surrendering what we think we know and trusting. And that wonderful phrase that I associate with John the Baptist, I must decrease and he must increase. There is something about surrendering our certainty and being open to those surprises where we find God. Prepare the way of the Lord. A voice crying in the wilderness, a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare. Amen.